part 2 of Adams through Tyler. We are on the Compromise of 1833. As I said in the last presentation, it looks like we're going to war. South Carolina and some other states have threatened to secede. President Jackson has threatened to hang Vice President John C. Calhoun over this. And so Henry Clay, the great compromiser, this will be the second of his great compromises. There's 3 of them we're going to talk about. This is the second one that he pushes through Congress. And in this bill, he passes through Congress, he would lower the nation's tariffs a percentage every 2 years for the next 10 years. To whereas in 1842, the tariff will be lower in 1842 than it is in 1832. So both sides agree to this. South Carolina repealed its nullification, and Clay saves us from war once again. Once again, this is the second time. The Missouri Compromise was the first. So, in 1830, Andrew Jackson decides he's going to be very lenient with Native Americans, and he's just going to simply remove them from the western part of the United States. He pays them money for relocating, and they're going to relocate into this land out west that's supposed to be very good. It's modern-day Oklahoma. And most Native Americans gave in and moved, not the Cherokee. The Cherokee actually sued and went to the Supreme Court. Now, the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee Natives are supposed to be one of the 5 civilized tribes, but I will let you know that they wrote a new language and dialect, and within 1 generation, the whole nation knew how to write it and knew how to understand it. They learned the language, and this has never been done in world history before since. So Cherokees are highly intelligent. So they owned their nation runs from western North Carolina down through northern South Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, Tennessee. All of this area is Cherokee land, and it has been for thousands of years. So they actually sued the federal government and sued Andrew Jackson, and it goes to the Supreme Court. And in the court case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ordered state officials to honor Cherokee property rights. In other words, the Cherokees won, and they have a right to their nation. They have a right to their land because it's their land. However, it's President Jackson who ignores the decision. And he makes his own way. He basically says this Marshall made his opinion, now let him enforce it. This is going to be very important. This is the presidential power presidents have to this day. They can choose what laws to enforce and what laws not to enforce. So Jackson chooses to enforce his law that he had Congress pass the Indian Removal Act and not enforce the Supreme Court's law. This is a fundamental constitutional issue, because the Supreme Court can rule on a law, but remember, it's the president who's responsible for enforcing the law. So, you have to ask yourself, was Jackson constitutionally right for doing this? And the answer, as we're going to find in the future, presidents have the right to enforce what laws they deem they need to. So we're going to see this come up again with Presidents Lincoln, Wilson, and President Roosevelt, FDR, in World War II. They're going to use their presidential powers. So moving on. What this leads to, it leads to the Trail of Tears in 1838. So the army sent in and they forced the Cherokees out of their homes. About 4,000 of them, about 16,000 of them overall, about 4,000 died. So they forced the Cherokees to march to Oklahoma, and this is under Van Buren. This is not Jackson in 1838. Jackson has retired. So this is President Van Buren, and he was Jackson's vice president in his second term. Soldiers conduct themselves very bad, very hostile toward Cherokees. They stole from the Cherokees. They beat and raped them. In some cases, Cherokees were killed while en route by the soldiers. All in all, about 4,000 of the 16,000 Cherokees died. That's why it's called the Trail of Tears. And to this day, here's a video if you want to watch that. But to this day, there are Native American groups that will not carry a $20 bill in their wallet simply because it has Jackson's likeness on it. And they have pushed for decades to get it removed, and it's supposed to be removed here soon. So, Andrew Jackson and the Second National Bank. So the Second National Bank, he saw this as benefiting the wealthy. The bank had actually done a really good job with our money supply and interest rates, but Western farmers were very unhappy with the bank's lending policies because the National Bank would not just give money to they would not give money unless you had a way to repay it. Their policies were a little stricter than the state banks. And so Western farmers felt slighted because they're not getting money for, they're not getting loans for their crops and all that. So Jackson runs for re-election and he declares the bank unconstitutional. And he knew he was doing this. He did this on purpose to make it an issue. He took a non-issue and made it an issue. Jackson vetoes the bank's charter in 1832, and this set up a key election issue because he knew the new Whig Party, led by Henry Clay, was not going to like this. So it actually becomes a major campaign issue. Henry Clay, he's going to run for president, I believe, 4 times, and he loses every time. This, I think, was his second time. And he loses, and Andrew Jackson ends up ending the charter for the National Bank in 1836. What he starts to do in 1832, 1833 is he moves the nation's money to state banks. And these are state banks he likes. These are state banks he says that will do a good job with them, with the money. These banks become known as pet banks. And that's the term you need to know. And this is where the nation's money goes at the end of the second bank's charter. So, and you can watch this video here. It's good on discussing this issue. So, you have to ask yourself, is Andrew Jackson a man of the people, or does he act as a king? This is often the question asked. And so here's a political cartoon, and look at what the cartoonist is trying to portray Jackson. Standing on the Constitution, standing on internal improvements and the U.S. Bank. And then you got to think McCulloch versus Maryland and Worcester versus Georgia. So you got to ask yourself, is he the man's people or is he a king? We have the Whig Party. They form in 1832. They ask for a larger federal government, industrial and commercial developments, and a centralized economy. The Whigs are very much like Federalists, just a new party. Democrats, of course, they want limited federal government, and they didn't trust Eastern merchants and business leaders. They were more for the small farmer, that sort of thing, agrarian party. You get your next president here because Jackson retires. The 8th president of the United States is Martin Van Buren. He serves 1 term from 1837 to 1841. As you see, Jackson's going to support him for his run for president. He's Jackson's vice president in his 2nd term. However, Martin Van Buren's going to have to deal with all of Jackson's policies. Jackson didn't really have to deal with them, and Van Buren's going to have to deal with them. Like the Trail of Tears in 1838. Well, you have an economic depression. It's called the Panic of 1837, and we're going to be in a major depression for like 4 or 5 years. Van Buren does little to ease the panic. Once again, presidents didn't get involved with economic problems because the economy followed natural laws, and that would eventually work itself out. That's the belief, and it usually did up until the 20th century. He believed in a limited federal government, and here are a couple of videos, the presidents, Martin Van Buren, and this one goes through the Panic of 1837. Both of them are good videos. So we'll fast forward because Martin Van Buren's not going to win a 2nd term. And who's going to beat him is this guy here. In the election of 1840, the Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison and John Tyler. So you get your first campaign slogan out of it, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Remember, William Henry Harrison was the victorious militia governor who beat Tecumseh in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe, hence his nickname, Tippecanoe. That's what he went by. People called him that the rest of his life. So Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and John Tyler's his vice president. Harrison wins the Electoral College and he wins the popular vote, and he becomes your 9th president. However, yeah, it tells you on this page. However, he has the dubious distinction of being the shortest term president ever elected. He only lives 32 days in office. He dies of pneumonia in early April. And here's why. First off, he's the oldest elected president of his day. He's 68 years old. And then he catches pneumonia and dies 32 days in office. And here's why. He felt compelled to give an hour-and-a-half speech to let the nation know that everything's going to be fine through this depression, through this panic they were in. And he gave an hour-and-a-half speech, and it happened to be sleet and rain on Inauguration Day in March, and he ended up catching pneumonia, and he died 32 days later. So this leaves us with a constitutional crisis. We don't know who's supposed to take over as president or if we're supposed to have another election because it doesn't say in the Constitution what we're supposed to do if a president dies. With John Tyler, he is the vice president, and he said, I should assume the power of president since I'm the vice president, and people just followed along and said, yeah. So the constitutional crisis is averted when John Tyler steps up and basically says, well, I'm the vice president. I should be the president now. So it's not going to be formally written out of who's going to take over as president when the president dies until 1965 with the 25th Amendment. So it had been custom until 1965. Think about it, guys. That's when most of our presidents have died, like all of them. We haven't had a president die in office since then so far. So he's often referred to, John Tyler's often referred to as his accidency. He didn't agree with the Whig Party and the Whig policies, his own party. He does get the Webster-Ashburton Treaty signed, and it establishes a firm boundary between the U.S., Canada, and Minnesota. So this is important. This is what his big thing he gets done as he's president. And we are finished.